It looked ordinary, in the way a hammer looks ordinary, until you watch a master carpenter swing it. A U.S. carrier plane, mid-war vintage, rolled to a stop under guard and canvas at a far shore air depot that wasn't supposed to have one. Its silhouette could have been any of the hard-working deck types that filled the Pacific sky. A single-engine, low-wing machine with a wide-track undercarriage and a hook jutting under the tail, its wings hinged like elbows to fold against cramped hangar decks. The first impression, to anyone who had spent time around salt spray and arresting wires, was that of a tool designed for punishment and repetition rather than delicate aerobatics. That is the essence of a carrier aircraft. It is not just a flying machine, it is a ship's machine. Every line, every fitting, every decision in its construction flows from the brutal routine of launch, recovery, refuel, rearm, and do it again before the sun goes down. To understand what the inspectors were about to find, you have to start with that logic. A land-based fighter can kiss a runway and roll forever. A carrier plane must survive an arrival that is deliberately abrupt. The hook must bite a cable strung across a deck that rises and falls. The shocks in the main struts must drink the energy of a barely flying brick. The engine must be ready to surge back to power if the hook skips, and the pilot must bolt for another try without grenading pistons or coughing to a stop. Corrosion is not a theoretical risk. It is the ocean creeping into every seam, and the system must fight it daily with coatings, drain paths, seals, and the insistence that parts fit the same way today as they did yesterday and will tomorrow. So the Americans, long before this particular airframe crossed a shoreline it shouldn't have, had poured their effort into reliable folding mechanisms, reinforced hinges, stout gear legs with proper heat-treated components, and systems arranged so deck crews could get at them fast. The aluminum skins were not just smooth. In places they were almost polished by design, because drag is a tax you pay with fuel and speed. And eventually, lives. People who had grown up in a different design culture, one that prized lightness and agility and the pilot's hand on a sensitive stick, might look at this squat, thick-rooted wing and call it inelegant. The truth is that elegance takes many forms. A straight line of flush rivets marching along a high-load panel can be as elegant as any slender taper when the sea is pounding your airplane like a drum. A landing gear door that closes without complaint even after it has been bent and straightened twice during a busy day is a kind of beauty. A wiring harness that refuses to chafe through in a salt-mist gale is a promise kept to the next crew that straps in. This captured airplane had been born into that philosophy. Its elevators were strong where others might be light. Its flaps were built for heavy use, with well-placed inspection ports and hinges that could be replaced in a hurry. Its engine sat under a cowl that did not merely look clean. It was designed to stay clean, with baffles that pushed air exactly where it needed to go. What makes an airplane carrier-borne is not a single trick like a tailhook, though the hook is iconic and sits there like a statement of purpose. It is the integration of 1,000 small decisions that, when taken together, withstand 1,000 landings, 100 storms, and weeks of deck operations without turning the machine into an exhausted relic. That is why the paint beneath the panels is not an afterthought but part of the structure's immune system. That is why the wing fold line is not a weakness, but a flexure designed to be strong in the planes that matter. That is why the airframe picks up weight where lesser designs chase weight away, because the mission demands that the plane come home onto a square of planks with a ship's wake streaming behind it. People measure performance in top speed, in climb rate, in turn radius. Sailors measure it in cycles, turnarounds, and the steadiness of a machine after a pilot has bounced it hard and the deck crew has begun swarming with hoses and belts and safety pins. So when a crew far from home found themselves with a mostly intact specimen of this American craft, they were not just looking at an airplane, they were looking at a compact argument about how to wage a war at sea. The men who towed it into the hangar and peeled back the covers were technicians and engineers of real skill, men who could, and often did, keep machines flying with little more than ingenuity and stubbornness. They knew a straight rivet from a sloppy one. They knew when a hinge line was lying to them and when a panel gap would become a crack. On the first walk around, they saw the telltales that make a mechanic purse his lips without even thinking. The consistent edge distances on the rivet rows, the lack of ripples at the trailing edge, the perfect spacing of access screws, the labeling that told humans, in plain language, which way to turn a valve or where to pull a pin. It would be a mistake to say that everything in this machine was exotic. It was not. Much of it was conservative, even boring. But it had been executed with consistency and a commitment to process that is hard to grasp until you are standing beside it. That commitment is what separates a one-off marvel from a fleet's worth of workhorses. The captured airplane radiated that feeling. It said, without words, that if you ordered 10 of these parts from a warehouse across an ocean, all 10 would fit without filing, and if they did not, the man who shipped them would answer to a system that cared. Even before a panel was removed, even before an engine cowl screw surrendered its first turn, the visitors were reading, in the hardware, a story about factories and jigs and calibration blocks in rooms they had never seen. That is what carrier-born really means. It means the sea is the last place that tolerates improvisation. It means the airplane you see is the tip of a spear made of procedures. As the guards stepped back and the hangar doors rolled shut, the work began in the quiet that follows a long breath. Photographs first, because you only get to disturb a virgin installation once. Measurements next, because once you know the baseline you can understand the choices. Then, in a rhythm that would become the heartbeat of the story, hardware came off, trays filled with fasteners laid out in the same order they were removed, fiberboard tags scribbled with positions and arrows, so no one would lie to themselves later about what came from where. A carrier plane had fallen into foreign hands, and the first calm truth it taught was this. It was a product of men who expected their machines to be beaten and to come back for more. That expectation had shaped everything. It would be the lens through which the rest of the investigation made sense. When the day ended, they covered the airplane again, not out of courtesy but to keep the dust from settling into the work they would do tomorrow. They locked the hangar with the same care they had used to unscrew each panel. Outside, night collected in the gaps between buildings. Inside, a line drawing began to form on a drafting board, a profile of wings and spars, and a short-handed list of questions. The next phase would not be romantic. It would be dates and sequences, a march from capture to teardown, to test to verdict. The men were ready. The machine had their attention. The story of the airplane can be told as a thread of dates tied to places, and in that form it becomes easier to see the logic rather than the legend. You begin with the day the airplane came down on the wrong side of a map. It did not arrive as a museum piece. It arrived with the smell of hot oil and the humiliation of being where it did not belong. However, it was coerced from the pays, sky combat damage, a navigation drift punished by weather, a pilot making the least bad decision in a cascade of bad options. It reached the ground in a condition that, while battered, left the core systems intact enough to tempt engineers. The first entry in the logbook is short and honest. A U.S. carrier plane secured, major structure sound, recovery arranged. The next entry is the transfer. Airplanes do not evaluate themselves, and soldiers are not trained for the kind of measurement a machine like this deserves. A convoy, a train, a truck bed padded with canvas and planks, these are the prosaic steps that carry a prize from the field to the bench. The depot that received it was not glamorous, it was competent. The men there knew that before any wrench turns, there must be an understanding of the question being asked. The question was never, is the enemy's airplane miraculous? The question was, what choices did its makers make, and why, and can any of that be learned or countered? So the command gave the order, and the airplane changed custody, vanishing from rumor and reappearing as a file number and a schedule. Then comes the staged teardown. Staged, because no one who has done this work rips an airplane apart in one ecstatic session. You begin with photographs in the round to fix the baseline. You mark every panel, every removable fairing, every cable run you can see. You inventory tools and fasteners because logistics is not separate from engineering here. If a panel uses a single type of screw across its length, that tells you something about the supply chain feeding the factory that made it. You move next to the engine cowl and the easy access covers, the places the original maintainers were meant to visit between sorties. You fight no hard battles at first. You let the airplane teach you how it wants to be serviced. Often you discover that someone designed it to tell you exactly that. Tags, stencils, flow arrows, a language of maintenance that says turn this, not that, and look here first. With the outer layer mapped, the work deepens. The wings are unfolded onto trestles, hinges exposed and measured. The locking pins and their detents are photographed, and the hardness of their steel is noted with a portable tester that leaves a dot like a birthmark on the metal. The hook mount is examined the way an archaeologist studies a temple column, not for decoration but for the way it transfers load into the bones of the fuselage. The landing gear is cycled not out of curiosity, but to see whether it speaks hydraulics in a dialect that suggests an organized doctrine. Hose part numbers that match across the left and right sides, fittings that are swaged to a specification rather than to a guess, reservoir sight glasses that can be read in low light by a sailor who has not slept much. The timeline's third beat is not spectacular to read, but it is the most meaningful. It is the slow accumulation of evidence that the airplane was built not as a singular machine but as an instance of a process. The test phase follows and always begins on the ground. An engine, even injured, will tell you the truth if you feed it clean fuel and cool air and let it warm until metal reaches its working shapes. The American engine did not buck or shake like a horse that had forgotten a rider. It settled into itself. Temperatures rose through the stages you expect if you have looked at enough engines. Oil pressure found a plateau that made sense. Magneto checks revealed a reluctance to quit in the face of vibration. There are few moments as quiet as a group of mechanics listening to a foreign engine and finding, line by line on their gauges, that nothing dramatic is happening. This quiet is not boring. It is awe in a modest suit. Taxi tests came next, because a tail dragger tells you in the first 100 meters whether its designers were kind to pilots. The captured machine's tail felt obedient. Rudder authority at low speed was adequate, perhaps even generous. Brakes bit evenly. Gear legs did not chatter over seams. It tracked straight when power came up, which means someone had gone to great lengths to align thrust and surfaces and to tame propeller effects with geometry rather than with prayer. Only after this courtship would any responsible team raise the tail, let alone lift the wheels from the earth. A few hops down the runway at a safe speed confirmed that the controls were honest, and the engine did not stumble when asked for a brief surge. No one was trying to prove heroics. The point was to see whether the airplane could be trusted to say what it meant. Then the verdict, which is never a single sentence but a sheaf of pages that try to put judgment in numbers. The language of the verdict was careful. It avoided adjectives that would invite superstition. It compared what was seen with what was expected, and in doing so, revealed the gap that led to the whispered line that would become famous. That this felt like work beyond the human, not because spirits haunted the assembly lines, but because human systems had been arranged so that the craft, from rivet to harness clip, behaved as if it had been made by hands that never got tired and minds that never lost count. The timeline closes with that recognition: capture, transfer, teardown, test, verdict. By the time the last date is inked, the airplane has stopped being a trophy and has become a teacher. When the team rolled the machine back under covers, they did so not to hide it but to protect the questions they would ask tomorrow. The next sequence would be less romantic than a diary of events and more like a ledger. Facts would be put into a spine that the narrative could return to as it climbed and turned. Dimensions, loads, capacities, margins, numbers are not decorations here. They are the bones the story must hang from. The first entries were already on the board. A story that relies only on adjectives becomes soft under the fingers. The captured airplane did not need flattery. It needed enumeration. Start with mass, because mass is the sentence that limits all the clauses that follow. Empty weight and loaded weight were not guesses but measured realities. and the scale told a truth that surprised no one raised on the logic of the sea. The machine carried more structure than a land plane of similar size. The wing had roots as thick as a clenched fist, not because someone loved drag, but because someone hated broken spars. The tricks that stole back some of the penalty were subtle. Fair transitions from fuselage to wing, leading-edge fillets that smoothed the crash of airflow where volumes met, tight skin work, so the air saw no more roughness than necessary. Wing area was chosen not purely for elegance at altitude, but for the authority needed at approach speeds over a deck that could not afford to be missed. Geometry came next. A wide track undercarriage reduces the dance on landing, and that is not a luxury at sea. The main gear legs were spaced to make crosswind recoveries survivable, and to reduce ground loops when a pilot's attention was stamped flat by a long day. The legs themselves were not delicate. They were built with the kinds of struts and torsion links that professional maintainers recognize as a promise. These will take a hit and, if they are bent within reason, can be brought back into alignment without replacing half the airplane. The tailwheel assembly was not an afterthought. It had a lock that engaged with a clunk you could feel through your boots. It told the pilot and the deck chief exactly when the machine was ready to go straight. The hook is more than a hook. It is an organ that transfers an ugly load into a body without tearing it. On this airplane, the hook mount sat in a cradle of structure that ran forward into strong members instead of ending in a plate and a prayer. The mount was not just bolted on. It was built in, with doublers and caps that suggested a design path traced by someone who had watched tests fail and knew how to fix them. The hook point itself showed wear that looked like a tool doing its job, rather than like a part failing at it. When measured and compared against what would be typical for a land-based tail skid or a simple wheel fork, the difference was so great that numbers almost felt like insults. The system was engineered for arrests measured in many dozens, not in a handful of emergencies. The engine numbers spoke the language of tempo, displacement and compression, supercharger stage and gear ratios, intercooler presence and duct size. None of these figures alone made this machine a killer. But together they described a heart that could beat hard on takeoff, loaf at cruise, and surge again without coughing out metal. Oil system capacity was not small, scavenging was efficient, and the baffling forced air where it needed to go, rather than letting hotspots breed cracks. Even the starter circuit, often a Cinderella topic, reflected a respect for the realities of a ship. A machine that starts cleanly saves time, saves fuel wasted in floods, saves tempers. The numbers for electrical capacity, generator output, and battery reserve told a similar story. Radios and lights and hydraulic actuators did not strain a penurious budget of electrons. When deck operations ask for a fold, the fold happens. When a signal asks to be heard, it is. Fuel and range mattered less in the evaluation than the integrity of the tanks and the reality of sealing. Early in the war, many airplanes, not only in one nation, learned the hard lessons of tanks that leaked and lines that were routed where shrapnel loved to travel. The captured machine's tanks were protected in a way that reflected experience rather than theory. Sealants were applied evenly, edges were dressed properly, and access to filters was arranged so that a man who had rinsed metal flakes from too many bowls would not have to contort himself to do it again. Range figures written on paper are one thing. Range available after weeks of cycles in salty air is another. The folding mechanism deserved its own line on the ledger. Hinges of this size are as much about alignment as about strength. If they do not return the wing to exactly the same place after every fold, the pilot discovers it on the next approach, and perhaps the next group of men discovers it when they carry him below. The hinges on this airframe engaged with a precision that left little doubt that a factory jig had set their mating faces. The locking pins slid with the kind of fit that tells a mechanic he can trust his eyes. The detents were clean, the safety devices positive rather than theatrical, and the wing folded without asking for 3 men to lean their weight into a reluctant joint. Numbers captured in the inspection ledger were short but telling: pin diameters, hinge gap, measured play at the tips, closing torque for the latches. A fleet's worth of reliability can be hidden in such homely figures. There were also the turnaround goals that attach to such a machine-like commandments. From chocks in to chocks out between sorties, the deck cycle lives or dies on how fast men can refuel, rearm, inspect, and sign off a plane that is still clicking as it cools. The Americans had set targets that were not poetry. They were minutes and steps and an order of operations that worked in dark weather and on long days. The captured airplane reflected those targets. Access panels for the guns opened along sensible hinges. Ammunition boxes could be pulled and pushed without contortion. Fuel caps were placed where hoses could find them, and vents did not reward haste with a bath. The hydraulic reservoir could be checked without removing an entire forest of things that blocked it. An intelligent cycle was embedded in the hardware. Finally, there was the matter of interchangeability, a word that reads dull and tastes like salvation to any maintainer. The fasteners were standard, and not only within one panel, across the airplane, you could carry a pocketful of the right screws and be confident they would see you through a day's worth of access. Fittings were marked in a consistent scheme, unambiguous to anyone who had read a manual, which meant a junior man could learn the airplane in a week and be genuinely useful in 2. The instruments spoke a common language of units. The wiring looms were tied with care, insulation thickness believable and consistent, routing done with an eye for avoiding chafe where it always tries to begin, at a clamp that someone forgot to line with anything soft. Each of these details fed a growing conviction that the numbers were not ornaments. They were, in a real and practical sense, the reasons the airplane was still itself after a journey that should have broken it. When the day's enumeration ended, the men did not feel closer to a mystery. They felt closer to a logic. They would carry this spine of facts into the next room, where the real first shock awaited. Numbers can prepare you for what you are about to touch. They cannot blunt the sensation of workmanship seen from inches away. The cowl screws turned without drama, which is a small thing until you have lived in a world where screws seize from a mixture of salt and neglect. Panels that had the right to stick, given their age and recent history, came free with a mild tug. Underneath lay the engine bay, not pristine in a ceremonial sense, but tidy in the working sense. Safety wire lay in neat patterns across the heads of bolts, always twisted in the correct direction, always cut to a length that did not leave daggers to slice a man's fingers. Hoses were routed with an eye for service access, and protected at rub points by sleeves or grommets that could not have been invented on the spot. Clamps wore their rubber-like belts, not like afterthoughts. The men around the airplane were not naive. They had seen careful work before. What struck them was that this did not look like a single artisan's day of pride. It looked like a factory's every day. Color was a language here. Hydraulic lines wore shades that told you what lived inside them. Electrical conduits bore stenciled reminders that corresponded to manual pages, as if invisible hands had taken pity on the harried sailor who would someday have to trace a fault in a storm. The battery leads were dressed neatly, not draped. The magneto wiring was not a nest but a deliberate weave. Even the way the cowl flaps linked to their actuators spoke of geometry fixed by drawing rather than by habit. Baffles hugged cylinder fins as if they had been measured after a lesson in airflow rather than guessed at from a distance. When a hand reached in to test the play in a linkage, it came back with the impression that the tolerances had been set by someone who knew not only how much was ideal, but how much would still be acceptable after a year of hard use. Move along the firewall and you find placards that do more than satisfy inspectors. They are instructions compressed into metal, punched or etched, so the words will survive hands and solvents. There is nothing mystical about a tag that says, "Drain here," with an arrow. But when that tag is riveted in a place where a man can actually see it while holding the hose that will catch what comes out, you feel that a designer has kept faith with the maintainer. The same faith lived in the quick disconnect fittings that mated with a satisfying click. They were not exotic. They were the kind of hardware you commit to in thousands because you intend to use them every day. A shop that has fought to keep an airplane running on odd fittings, scavenged from other odd fittings, recognizes the luxury instantly. The interior of the wing, once opened, continued the theme. Rivet lines marched straight and true. edge distances consistent, rows staggered where they should be to spread load and avoid crack propagation. Wherever the skin met a rib, the contact points sang the same song. A good fit, a clean hole, a shop head that had not been beaten into submission but pressed into it. In high-speed flow areas, the rivets were flush and not by accident. Countersinks were even, burrs were absent where they mattered, and the final surface felt like a decision rather than a compromise. You could tell where drag had been shaved with intention. You could also tell where the designers had chosen not to chase the last knot of speed because the wing had to fold, the hinge had to be strong, and the deck had to be forgiving. That blend of polish where polish pays and blunt robustness where survival demands, it was the surprise. It reflected an adulthood of design that comes only when you are not seduced by any single metric. Electrical looms ran through the wing in runs that made sense. At bulkhead penetrations, grommets nested properly, not as decorations but as guardians. On a hot afternoon, when a mechanic's patience runs thin, a loom that sits where it should and refuses to chafe is the difference between an airplane that goes up again and one that eats a day. Control cables lay with a slackness that was calibrated, not sloppy, and they ran fair through pulleys with guards that would keep a stray tool from nicking a strand. The pulleys themselves spun smoothly, grease present where it belonged and absent where it would attract grit. Every few inches the evidence repeated itself, not genius but discipline. A word about corrosion, because the sea is a patient enemy. Inside the skins, primer-coated surfaces with a uniformity that told of spray booths and checklists. In corners where moisture loves to linger, the finishing was thorough, not just on the first few examples that a foreman knew would be inspected. Fastener heads bore the slight, telltale shade of coatings, chosen to slow the creep of white fuzz that turns aluminum from structure into lace. Drain paths existed where they ought to. There were tiny holes that let water escape from cavities that would otherwise become tanks. The sum of these small mercies is not glamour, it is longevity. It is the reason a machine can live on the ocean without becoming a collection of problems. The cockpit, when the canopy was opened, looked like a place made for a human rather than a place a human had been forced to occupy. Instruments were grouped by function in a way that hinted at doctrine rather than whim. Power controls fell to hand, the throttle quadrant ran smooth, the propeller pitch control resisted just enough to reassure. Switches carried guards where an accidental brush of a sleeve could ruin a day. Placards used a simple, consistent font, and did not shout new vocabulary at a pilot who already had plenty to think about. The seat rails engaged positively, and the harness hardware looked like what it was. The last promise between the man and the ceiling of the cockpit when the deck came up to meet him. There is kindness in such hardware. It is the kindness of professionals to professionals. On the shop floor, someone held one of the airplane's fasteners up to the light. The slots were clean, the threads rolled rather than cut, the dimensions exactly where a gauge said they should be. The same someone walked to a cabinet, took a counterpart from a tray, and mated them. No drama. That quiet click of metal against metal that fits, each time, on every example, was the sound that moved a man to mutter the line that would be remembered. To people who had been making greatness one careful hand fit at a time, the feeling that every part here had been given the same attention by a system, not by a saint, felt uncanny. It felt like something beyond the reach of ordinary hours and ordinary hands. "This isn't human work," he said, and he did not mean that ghosts had riveted the wings. He meant that the human effort had been arranged so that error found no home, so that good practice was the path of least resistance, so that excellence happened not as a miracle but as a default. The contrast with their own daily lives was not an insult to their skill. It was a mirror held at a hard angle. Material shortages push you into choices you regret later. Factory jigs, rushed or repaired under pressure, leave their signature in odd fits and wandering lines. A design culture that chases lightness as the only religion yields machines that dazzle in clear air and then tire under punishment. None of this is a moral failing. It is history distilling into metal. And yet, standing beside the captured airplane, the men could feel another history humming, one of warehouses that deliver, of tolerances that hold across thousands of units, of line workers who are not asked to invent solutions at their benches because those solutions have been frozen into the drawings already. By the time the cowl was back on and the panels were set aside in order, the workmanship shock had faded into professional concentration. The men were past awe and into curiosity of a higher grade. They wanted to see how the engine handled heat in a long run. They wanted to see how the gear tolerated a hard roll-in and whether the shock struts returned to the exact ride height every time. They wanted to know how the wing fold coped with grime, how the seals held up to solvents, whether the quick couplings leaked when treated without tenderness. The airplane had earned their respect. Now it would earn their data. When the lights clicked off and the hangar door's last inch met the floor, the image that remained was of order rather than mystery. The shock of seeing such consistent workmanship did not numb the men. It gave them a vocabulary for what they would test next. Tomorrow would be a practical sermon in systems and in the way a carrier plane turns individual craft into a fleet. The engine bay was a study in confidence. Confidence does not shout. It arranges itself so that nothing important is hard to reach and nothing fragile is forced to endure more than it must. Removing the remaining cowl sections revealed a power plant that did not beg for reverence but invited inspection. The men leaned in to read the story written in castings and clamps, in the sweep of ducts and the choice of elbows over tight, choking bends. Supercharging in this machine was not a talismanic word tossed into conversation. It was a practical answer to a practical need. The impeller and its drive were tucked, where temperature and vibration would not torment them unnecessarily, their housings secured with fasteners that implied regular service intervals. You could see in the very shape of the ducts that engineers had hooked a finger around the ear of airflow and persuaded it rather than bullied it, swelling the cross-section where air had to slow and recover pressure, squeezing it only where speed was the friend of mixing and cooling. Intercooler cores sat like quiet guardians, not oversized to impress but sized to work, their fins protected by screens that would stop the kind of hangar grit that sneaks into open mouths during long maintenance days. The baffles around the cylinders fit as if they had been measured to the machine, not to a drawing left in a desk. Someone had cared about the gap between baffle and fin as a dimension worth protecting. On the firewall, accessories lined up as a logic diagram. The generator was not jammed into a hot corner where it would cook. The oil cooler was not asked to do two jobs at once or to work with air that had already surrendered its virtue to some other task. Hoses could be traced with one finger from source to destination without the finger getting lost under a tangle of afterthoughts. It is impossible to overstate the effect of quick change philosophy on the morale of the men who keep an airplane alive. This power plant wore that philosophy openly. Magnetos could be freed without stripping neighboring hardware. The starter came away cleanly, its fasteners captive where they ought to be, so they would not drop into dark places and turn a short job into a hunt. Filters sat where the hand that would remove them could hold a cup beneath and catch what came out. Every maintenance task has a moment where insult waits, a bolt you cannot start, a clamp that refuses to bite. This engine had been designed to erase as many of those moments as a human mind could anticipate. The result was not merely faster service. It was fewer opportunities for error, because tired people do fewer stupid things when a system refuses to provoke them. Electrical discipline ran like a current through the bay. Bundles were not just tied, they were routed away from heat and away from moving parts in a manner that suggested 1,000 eyes had signed off on the path. Where a bundle crossed a frame-lightening hole, a grommet stood between insulation and edge, with the quiet determination of a friend who pays the bill without mentioning it. Connectors engaged with a firmness that inspired trust. There were no anonymous splices, no little bits of wire that told a tale of a hurried fix during a crisis. Even the colors made sense, and their repetition was a promise that the same choices had been made in the next airplane, and the next. Hydraulics, the invisible muscle of carrier aviation, spoke in the same language. Reservoir, pump, valve blocks, actuators, each element sat where a man could get to it with minimal disturbance to its neighbors, and the lines between them ran in arcs rather than kinky consonants. There is a smell to a hydraulic leak that seeps into memory as surely as smoke does. Nothing in this bay stank of that future. Installers' paint marks lay across nut and fitting in thin strokes, the kind that crack and betray any movement. The men traced the system out to the wing folds and to the landing gear wells, where rams and linkages awaited a life of obedience. Brackets bore the gentle witness marks of factory alignment, tools. If they had been forced into place by levers and curses, nothing else would have fit as cleanly as it did. Cooling is where many engines declare their humanity and their weakness. Here, the path air took through the engine told of men who had sat with chalk and sketches, and then walked out to stand by running test articles until the chalk turned into aluminum. The inlets were not gaping maws, they were measured mouths that opened just enough to feed the beast without turning the airplane into a flying bucket. Air left through cowl flaps that swung with a weight and a speed that matched the demands of hot climbs and cooling descents alike. The flap actuators were neither overbuilt anchors nor delicate ornaments. They were as strong as they had to be, and no stronger, an economy achieved by people who owned enough test data to sleep at night. The fuel system had the smell of thought. Lines ran to a manifold that would not trap bubbles in a corner. Drains presented themselves to gravity as if remembering that men do not need any more excuses to spill fuel. Tanks had access panels that did not require knees made of rubber or shoulders that pop. Where sealant touched structure, it had been applied with the monotonous neatness that only repetition can teach. Vents lived where pressure would treat them kindly, protected from ram and spray, the openings cut without the ragged edges that turn airflow into a tiny saw. Then there were the small generosities that are not small, a tool tray that fits in the groove under a line of fasteners so the hardware removed has somewhere to live. A removable light where a man can aim it without borrowing a second pair of hands. A ground strap path that creates no loops and invites no mistakes. A handhold that appears where an inspector would otherwise plant his palm on a delicate surface. A throttle linkage that offers a faint but honest resistance at key points. A tactile announcement that the lever has arrived at detent and that the next inch is a different phase of engine life. When they spun the propeller through by hand, the blades moved with a weight that needed no poetry to explain. The pitch change mechanism responded smoothly, values on a bench gauge rising and falling with reassuring linearity. Harmonic damper hardware bore the marks of the same hands that had rolled threads and dressed corners everywhere else. The propeller hub itself was a concentration of intention, designed to take the invisible beating of vibration as a duty, not as an insult. There was no sense that this was a borrowed part pressed into a job it hated. It belonged where it Saturday. The men closed the bay and stood back, a line of smudged faces and folded arms. An engine is a promise, and the airplane's promise was not an extravagant one. It did not offer to rewrite the rules of thermodynamics. It offered to be faithful to the rules every day for as long as the men who served it kept their end of the bargain. That is what the best systems do. They reduce the number of bargains to only the necessary ones. The conclusion the team began to share, without needing to say it out loud, was not that the power plant was brilliant in isolation. It was brilliant because it did not isolate itself. It was part of a web of decisions that began at the drafting table, ran through suppliers and gauges and paint booths, and landed here as metal and gasket and wire, waiting to be woken into heat. Tomorrow, they would wake it longer, and the story would continue in temperatures, in pressures, in lines on paper that tucked themselves inside acceptable limits and refused to stray. There is an honesty to structural members stripped of their skin. In the spaces where paint meets rivet row and spar cap meets web, you can see what an airplane thinks it is for. This one thought it belonged on a ship. The landing gear told that truth before any other component did. Wide stance, generous knuckles, oleos so stout they seemed to flinch at. None of it was by accident. The struts bore polished cylinders, whose finish was neither vanity nor mere corrosion defense. Polish helps a seal live the life it must live, stroking cleanly, refusing to grind grit into its own lip. When the men bled the air from the struts and cycled them through travel, they did so with the ceremonial seriousness of priests, because here resided the bargain between a falling machine and a rising deck. The return to ride height after a simulated hit was within a whisper of the same mark each time. That repeatability is not born of hope. It is born of bore tolerances held across dozens of parts and of a fluid system that refuses to froth when asked for violent kindness. The geometry of the gear mattered as much as its guts, angled forward just enough to forgive an imperfect touchdown, spaced widely enough to forgive a crosswind's little jokes. The legs sat inside wells, lined as if to welcome a guest who might have to come home muddy. Doors closed with a snick rather than a slap, their hinges arranged to transfer loads into places that could bear them without slowly loosening the airplane's face. In the wells, hydraulic lines bent in gentle arcs that said fatigue would not set its trap at a sharp elbow. The brake units, when opened, revealed pistons that wore their seals evenly, and the pads met the discs squarely enough that you knew the caliper bodies had been machined on fixtures that kept faith with themselves across long shifts. The tail proclaimed a different vow. A wheel that locks when commanded is a small miracle on a moving deck, and here the lock engaged in a way that thrilled men who had watched other locks pretend to behave. The fork bearings sat in perfect alignment, not a paint line out of place, as if to announce they had not been bullied into fitting on some tired afternoon at the end of a production run. The actuating cable ran the long path back to a lever that a pilot could find with gloved fingers and command without looking. The casting that housed the tailhook pivot was the true heart of the matter, though. Thick where shock would bite, shaped to spread that bite into surrounding structure, it bore the witness of a design that had been allowed to fail under test and then had been healed properly. Cracks were not tolerated. They were studied and banished in metal, not just in words. Tie-down and handling points, those humble details that separate combat aircraft from museum queens, walked along the fuselage and wings like punctuation. Every few feet, a reinforced ring or pad sat flush enough not to ruin airflow on a good day, and proud enough to be found by a hand on a bad one. On carrier decks, wind has a personality and opinions. Tying a machine down is not a courtesy but a requirement. The captured airplane made provision for that requirement without sulks. Toe fittings declared themselves at sensible heights, where a tractor's hook would find them in the dark without gouging skin, and their brackets were not ornaments. They sent their loads into ribs and frames through laminated paths, the way a tree sends wind into roots through branches and trunk. The wing fold was the cathedral where many of these doctrines met. If you have not watched a wing fold, the sight of structure yielding to a hinge can be unsettling. Here it felt as natural as a breath. The hinge line was placed not at some arbitrary chordwise fraction chosen in a moment of whimsy, but at a structurally forgiving location, one that let the folded wing balance on deck without wanting to twist itself into tears. Locks engaged with positive stops that announced their status by feel and by sound, and safeties existed that could not be forgotten without breaking the path of motion. Pins wore the polish of steel that would not oval under mischievous loads, and bushings looked as though they could be replaced before the hinge jaws ever suffered. At the fold, seals kept rain and spray from finding nesting places inside the wing where corrosion would hatch. Electrical and hydraulic couplings at the fold brake were designed to tolerate movement, not endure it reluctantly, which meant the airplane could fold and unfold through 1,000 cycles without fraying its own nerves. Inside the fuselage, the frames around the hook bay and the gear mounts took the part of a ship's ribbing. You could see how loads would run when a wire caught the hook like a whip. You could trace the path as if following a river on a relief map, out through webs, along caps, into skins that seemed too thin, until you remembered that triangles are bolder than rectangles when it comes to carrying insult. The men read those paths with their fingertips. Their minds supplied the rest. The slam of an arrestment in quartering seas, the pilot's shoulders catching the harness, the deck crew crouching and then springing forward as the wire went slack. In their heads they checked each fastener for complicity in the scheme. The airplane passed these private interrogations with the calm of a defendant who has nothing to hide. Arrangement on the deck leaves its fingerprints all over an airplane. Lifting points that match the spacing of a ship's cranes. Handholds where men in wet gloves can actually grip. Steps that a boot can trust. placards that specify the angles and weights cranes and jacks should respect. In the captured airplane, all of this took the form of a dialect that spoke ship as a first language, not as an accent learned later. It was visible in the way the parking brake lever worked in harmony with the tailwheel lock, so that positioning an aircraft on a crowded deck was a ritual with predictable outcomes. It was audible in the way the gear doors, once restored to power, closed with the same timing on both sides, a small synchrony that betrays sound plumbing and well-set flows. The bones of the cockpit confirmed the commitment. The harness anchors were triangulated into the structure. They did not dangle from a convenient bracket. The seat rails bit into mounts that had room for wear to develop without immediately turning sloppy. The canopy rails and their drains recognized that ocean air condenses on cold glass and then looks for a place to go. Here it found a legitimate exit rather than pooling into trouble. The stick's base and the rudder pedal's pivots spoke of habitability under duress, because a pilot who fights his controls is a pilot who cannot consistently repeat the fine motor skills arrestments demand. All this might sound like adoration of mundane details. It is anything but. In the life of a carrier airplane, magic is expensive and fickle. Geometry and discipline are free after you have paid the cost of thinking and the cost of teaching 1,000 hands to repeat what the one mind decided. The bones of this airplane radiated that economy. When the men ran their measuring tapes and scribbled their figures, they were not flattering a foreign ideology. They were mapping a way of survival. The shock of the first inspection had softened into an understanding. This airplane endured the sea not by being harder than the sea, but by being more predictable than the sea. Its bones had been taught to behave, and in that lesson lay the key to tempo. Engines can be courted on stands. Airplanes must be courted on their feet. After the first cautious ground run, the team returned with a list drawn from the neat chaos of overlapping responsibilities. Stabilize oil temperature at a sustained power setting. Observe cylinder head temperatures across the span of cowl flap positions. Cycle the gear repeatedly while watching accumulator behavior. Fold and unfold the wings until boredom threatened to dull the senses. Then test the radios through the frequencies they could access and the power settings they dared to apply. Reliability, if it exists, reveals itself not in one triumphant gesture, but in 100 ordinary obediences. The long run began with the usual ceremonies. Fire bottles stood ready. Chocks respected the wheel with the intimacy of old friends. A man with a headset crouched by the wing root and gestured to another man at a panel. The airplane's lungs filled, and then the propeller moved from suggestion to decision. The note settled. Gauges that had leapt to life in the first minute found their places. Oil warmed toward the band the manual asked for, pausing shy of it, and then, with the cooler flaps doing their gentle work, crossing into it like a traveller arriving on time. Cylinder head temperatures treated the engineer to a sight both reassuring and rare, all within a narrow bracket, no black sheep insisting on complications. Even the smell of the exhaust was respectable, no eye-watering richness from a flooded start, no sour lean shake. It was the signature of a mixture control that could be trusted, and of airflow that had not been forced into folly by a poor choice jetting or ducting. After 20 minutes at a steady setting, the team ran a sequence of throttle movements that would have flushed out reluctance in a less disciplined machine. The response was prompt, but not nervous. Increments happened in increments, not in leaps that suggest hidden lags in pumps or sticky linkages. The magneto checks asked the engine to prove it was truly redundant where it claimed to be, and the aching sameness of the drop on each side was a balm. The engineer with the pencil made a mark and allowed himself to stop pressing the tip into the paper so hard that it dented the page. The hydraulics rehearsal could have been designed by a choreographer. Gear down, gear up, and again, each cycle a data point on pressure and time. With reservoirs at the same fill level, the timing repeated itself uninterestingly. It is a strange thing to praise boring behavior, but on a flight deck the only exciting hydraulics are broken hydraulics. Folding the wings introduced new motions and volumes to the pump's task, and still the pressure line did not saw its way into jagged peaks and valleys. The team swapped one filter element for another with slightly different manufacture marks. Both fit well enough that only a conscience could tell the difference. The hoses did not weep. The quick connects connected without projecting a fine mist of disapproval into the air. Vibration, which so often works screws loose as a matter of principle, did not manage to move any of the fittings from their paint-marked homes during the hours the team would eventually accumulate over many days. Then came the taxi trials. The airplane rolled with a willingness that spoke of bearings that had been sized with care. At slow speeds, the tail responded to the rudder early, which is less a matter of caprice than of the way air is guided and flung aft by the propeller disc. As speed crept up, the men felt the tail lightening as it should under a wash of air that had been asked to do many jobs and still had enough to lavish on stability. Brake applications did not lurch the machine to one side, and the nose did not dip excessively as if chiding the pilot for imprecision. The tailwheel lock tested and released, and tested again, obeyed. Small things, how easily the airplane tracked a painted line, how soon after throttle application the swing began, and how manageable it remained, accumulated into the larger thing no one wanted to name yet. Trust. A series of low hops followed after a consultation more formal than it looked. The test pilot, who had seen more runways from more odd angles than any one man should, advanced the throttle to a target agreed in advance. The tail came up when and how they expected. The wings began to carry themselves. The wheel noises went thin and then paused. In the realm a few feet above any runway, human beings discover whether designers respected them. The controls were honest. They did not ask for frantic correction or lull with laziness into a mistake. A small slip produced a small response. A flare that came a fraction early did not punish with a buck. When the wheels returned to the ground, the gear accepted the energy, remembered how tall it was supposed to be, and became that tall again. The pilot repeated the performance until his own body learned the tempo of the airplane's reply. Electrical trials came in interludes, as though to remind everyone that radios and lights are systems too. The generator output remained in the expected range as loads were added and removed. Interference stubbornly refused to appear on the headset as the hydraulic pump worked or the gear cycled. The wiring harnesses, which had the right to wag their tails inside the fuselage and shake noise into the ether, did not. The men called call signs in clipped phrases, listened to their echoes, and nodded to each other as if to say that, in this at least, the machine was good company. None of this would have mattered if the systems had shown that they could only behave when coddled. The team tried to cheat in polite ways. They allowed the engine to sit in a warm soak after a hard run, and then asked it to start without the indulgences normally offered. It did. They closed the cowl flaps a little too much, and watched the temperatures rise into a zone that would have bothered them, and then reopened the flaps and watched the numbers walk back down with civilized speed. They folded the wings after letting oily dust settle on the hinge line and found, to their relief and faint annoyance, that the hinges did not seize and the pins did not complain. A mechanic dropped a washer in a place where it might have gone to die. It clinked harmlessly against a tray that someone had designed into the space to catch such strays. The word impossible is a dangerous one. It invites argument from reality. What the men felt when they let the long day end and the airplane rest was not that the machine had broken impossibility, it was that it had made reliability feel easy. Human beings tend to mistake ease for magic, especially when they are tired. The notion that something isn't human work is born not of superstition but of a sudden perception that the ordinary friction of tasks has been sanded away. In that smoothness lies a new category of effort, the kind that makes a man imagine that an unseen hand is helping. The unseen hand here was simply the hand of other men, multiplied by system and by intention, leaving fingerprints in predictability rather than in polish. That was the lesson the airplane gave up during the tests. If you can make 100 small promises and keep them, the total begins to feel like a miracle. By the time the team pushed their stools back from the benches and laid down their pencils for the evening, they had stopped talking about the airplane as if it were a solitary animal. They had begun to talk about the place it came from. Every system they had touched bore marks of a culture that had learned to push quality upstream until the downstream life of the machine was easy. Those marks were not mystical. They were practical fingerprints of a production line that behaved like a musical score, guiding 1,000 hands to the same notes every day. Consider the rivet rows the men had admired in the first hours. Straight lines are not accidents. They are enforced by jigs that do not forgive wandering. The panel fit they praised was baked in by fixtures holding skins while holes were drilled in matched assemblies. This is not to say artisanship was absent. It is to say that artisanship was harnessed, asked to set up the first correctness, and then to teach that correctness to steel and to pins, so that repetition would not degrade it. In the captured airplane, long panels met at edges that were consistent because no one was allowed to decide on the day exactly where the meeting would occur. A gauge existed somewhere, and the edge had to satisfy it. Somewhere else a different gauge, confirmed that the holes lay at this distance from that edge, and no other. The inspectors could feel the presence of these ghosts, the shop aides, the go divided by no-go templates, not as an oppression, but as a reassurance that the people building these machines had been protected from the worst enemy of quality, improvisation under schedule. This was equally true in sub-assemblies. Control surface horns lined up with hinge points on the first fit because their attach patterns were drilled in nests that locked them down at angles set by screws no one could adjust casually. When the men freed one flap completely and hoisted it to a scale just to see, they found a weight that matched the number chalked inside the other flap within a margin so small it felt like a joke. That match is not magic. And it is not only the product of similar materials, it is born of a line that insists that when a worker reaches into a bin for a bracket, the bracket pulled on Monday is the twin of the bracket pulled on Friday, stamped with the same die, punched cleanly by the same press, its burrs knocked off by the same finishing wheel, maintained to the same standard. Hardware told the story in miniature. Thread pitches marched across the machine as if a single mind had planned which sizes would dominate. Where specialty fasteners existed, they existed for reasons that could be traced to load or environment, not to the whims of a supplier or to a shortage that had been dignified into a design feature. Safety wire holes arrived where bolt heads requested them because the heads had been made with the wires in mind, not drilled on benches by impatient hands. In the stores that had fed the assembly, boxes likely bore labels a new man could read on his first day and be right on his first reach. The airplane wore that literacy visibly. Paint and primer offered evidence of rooms and routines too. Under the skin, the primer's uniformity hinted at hangars where temperature and humidity were controlled by more than luck. Over the primer, the finish coat lay even enough that the men could decide that the final sanding had been done with jigs that held curved panels in shapes they would adopt later on the airframe, preventing the heartbreak of edges warped by overzealous hands. Masking lines around placards and windows bore few of the little scallops that betray tape laid in haste. This matters, not because beauty is a performance metric, but because sloppiness reveals itself everywhere. A line that demands straight tape around a warning placard is a line that demands straightness where the human eye cannot see. Deep inside a wing, hidden beneath a floor, buried in a loom. Supply chain logic traced itself across the airplane like the stitching in a quilt. The clamps on fuel lines were the same clamp repeated, not an ecumenical congregation of similar but not identical species. The leather or rubber padding inside them matched in thickness and in cut. The instruments spoke in a common language of units, pointer styles, and face typography. Such harmonization does not occur by accident. It is cheap only after you have invested in making it cheap, negotiating with vendors so that part numbers converge, teaching the drawing office to specify what the store can deliver without needing a heroic search, and giving the factory time to adjust. The airplane was a monument to those invisible bargains, paid for long before it ever rolled to a stop in a foreign hangar. Most telling of all were the concessions to inspection built into the machine. Witness marks on critical bolts were applied in colors that appeared again and again, the shades not drifting as if mixed by eye each morning in a jar. Small drilled holes lived in places where a man with a borescope, or lacking one, A keen eye could confirm that engagement had occurred deep inside a space. Access panels were sized not simply to permit the passage of a part, but to permit the passage of a hand holding a tool at the angle the fastener would require. Stencils pointed not only to drains and fills, the obvious things, but to checkpoints that over time had proven worth a glance. This is the kind of love a factory learns only by listening to a fleet as it ages. That love reverberated across the captured airframe in quiet ways, and the men reading it responded with their own respect, because they knew what it took to get a lesson from the flight line onto a drawing, and then from a drawing into a habit. If there was a single sensation that tied all these fingerprints together, it was the feeling that the airplane had been built to be the same on Monday as on Thursday, in winter as in summer, in one plant as in another. That sameness, the very thing that makes a poet sigh, makes a maintainer's shoulders drop in relief. It was the sameness that freed line chiefs to plan. It was the sameness that allowed spares to move through space and find a home wherever they landed. It was the sameness that let a pilot climb from one cockpit into another and find that the throttle arc, the pressure of the detents, the reach to the gear lever, all the tactile expectations of a life spent landing on ships were honored. Those are the conditions under which a war at sea can be sustained. Not because any single airplane is invincible, but because the fleet is a machine made of machines, and the production line is the heart that supplies them. The men who stood around the captured airplane could not see the machines that had made its parts. They could not smell the coolant of the milling centers or hear the rattle of the rivet guns bolted into articulated arms, but they could infer their existence. They could feel the rhythm of fixtures, the patience of gauging stations, the hum of conveyors. In their notebooks, beyond the measured numbers, appeared sentences that were not about wings or hooks at all. They were about the factory that had managed to take the variability of thousands of human beings and press it into a narrow channel where error found little room to grow. It was in those sentences, when they began to look back over their own fleet and their own factories, that the line everyone would quote found its fuller meaning. This wasn't an accusation of sorcery. It was an acknowledgement that the real work, the work that looked more than human because it was so consistently good, had been done before the airplane ever met the sky. The stories started almost at once, because stories always hurry to fill the spaces that data leaves. Men who had only seen the airplane under tarpaulins insisted it was indestructible. Others decided the metal itself must be a secret alloy, unavailable to anyone else, a blend that could laugh off salt, impact, and fatigue. A few swore it was decades ahead, belonging to a future that had slipped into the present by mistake. It is pleasant to live among such tales. They flatter the witness by making him custodian of wonder, but hardware has a way of answering with facts, and the facts refuse to be enchanted. What looked like indestructibility was really the relentless arithmetic of margins, extra thickness, where history proved cracks like to start, radiused corners where carelessness invites stress to concentrate, fastener spacing chosen by test rather than by hope. The airplane took punishment not because it was immune to harm, but because it anticipated the likely insults and paid for resilience with weight and workmanship. As for the metal, the measurements and the spark tests said what anyone with a cool head expected. Competent aluminum alloys, well heat-treated, well protected, not the product of sorcery, but of a supply chain that could meet specification day after day. The witchcraft lay in consistency. When a factory can promise that every spar cap born on a Wednesday will behave like the spar caps born on Monday, the fleet on the far side of the ocean can plan its life with confidence. Enemies standing beside the captured airplane felt the weight of that promise and mistook it for something supernatural, because they knew too well the sick feeling of opening a crate and finding parts that had been made cousins rather than twins. Even the decades ahead line dissolved under a lamp. Nothing here violated physics or introduced an unknown principle. What felt advanced was discipline, cooling air that went where it should, baffles shaped by time in test cells rather than by improvisation, hydraulic lines that rooted with gentleness because someone had cared about fatigue, not because someone had drafted poetry. The radios worked not because an angel guarded the filaments, but because vibration had been treated as an enemy at the design stage, so mounts and looms cushioned and guided as a matter of course. When a machine behaves as if it wants to help its operators, people are tempted to bend the knee. The sober conclusion was better than worship. The airplane was the sum of mature choices, paid for in advance. There were, of course, limits the legends ignored. The engine would fry its temper if abused with indifference. The hook mount would complain if asked to save a pilot from an approach flown far outside the envelope. The wing folds would grow loose if no one bothered with inspection intervals. The miracle only persists under the discipline that created it. What the team wrote, quietly, in the margins of their reports was not a hymn but a translation. The myths had spoken in wide strokes about marvels. The reality was more interesting. A system had found a way to make good behavior cheap, and by making it cheap had made it common. Once a machine acquires a reputation, everything said about it arrives coated in a fine mist of exaggeration. The right response is not to sneer, but to arm the listener with habits. The first habit is to ask for paper. An anecdote that charms a room may wilt when you demand inspection notes, tear down photos, or test logs with dates and initials. The second habit is to trace any declarative sentence back to a mechanism. If someone declares the airplane unbreakable, ask where the loads run when the hook takes a wire, how the energy is absorbed, what thickness and alloy carry the insult, what radius turns a sharp corner into a forgiving one. A claim without a path is a weather report from a man who never looks up. The third habit is to subtract the theatre of the edge case. A single airframe that survives a grotesque landing is an instructive story. But the fleet does not live by miracles. It lives by the median. Interchangeability, service access, the number of minutes in a deck cycle, the percentage of sorties flown on schedule across a month. These are dull words that outperform poetry. When someone remembers a moment of astonishment, weigh it against the logbook arithmetic of all the other days when the airplane did exactly as asked and returned to chocks without drama. The miracle, if one exists, is made of those days. It helps to learn the red flags of wishful talk. Beware the word secret when used as a substitute for hard. Most of what looks magical in metal turns out to be the result of tedious thinking applied at scale. Doubt any story that relies on a single unnamed source, or that migrates from one publication to another without gathering new facts along the way. Distrust the photograph that supplies more emotion than context. Demand dates. The calendar sobers narratives, forcing them to admit that men learn, factories retool, and procedures evolve. If a description implies that a country woke up one morning with a new doctrine fully formed, consult your experience of human organizations and smile. Finally, grant the machine its dignity without inviting superstition. Respect is warranted, adoration is not. The right kind of admiration looks like questions lined up and answered, looks like wrenches in trays and torque values penciled on tags, looks like the humility to accept that your own practice can be improved by imitation of someone else's better habits. Reading claims well turns you into a participant rather than a spectator. You begin to listen for the improvisations men are forced into when a system starves them of spares. You notice whether a photograph shows safety wire running the correct way. You catch sight of a grommet that will save a loom from chafing and understand in that small kindness the large culture that produced it. In that mode, claims no longer wash over you. They resolve into signals. The airplane does not become smaller when stripped of myth. It becomes clearer. A captured machine lives two lives after the cameras are put away. One life is the love affair of the shop, where men learn its habits and measure its margins. The other life is bureaucratic and, if done correctly, saves more lives than any single test hop ever could. Somewhere beyond the hangar, a chain of desks receives the reports. Technical bureaus do what they exist to do. Compare the foreign machine against their own designs, list improvements that can be stolen honestly, and categorize features that cannot be ported in time to matter. Doctrine writers read with a different eye. They ask how the enemy sustains a tempo, how a deck cycle consumes and restores readiness, how often a system forgives error, how much training a new pilot needs before he can fly the ship's rhythm without breaking himself or the airplane. The decisions that follow are constrained by realities that admit no romance. Factories cannot become other factories overnight. A fleet cannot swap its bones mid-campaign. Fuel, pilots, and hours on airframes form a budget that does not expand when a report uses a bold adjective. So the question, who decides, really means, who can translate admiration into action without lying to the calendar? In the best cases, the answer is a small group with authority to touch drawings, to issue service bulletins, to change inspection intervals and access panel sizes, and the thickness of a doubler where cracks have been found. It is a rare joy when something larger can be attempted, an adoption of a better routing for a hydraulic line across a family of airplanes, a new standard for safety wire practice taught to every apprentice, a change in the way clamps are padded, or a new rule that color codes must be obeyed even when hurry is shouting. Operational meaning also flows the other way, from the shop back to the line. If the captured airplane shows that a wider gear stance will forgive clumsy landings, the doctrine may shift to accept slightly higher approach weights because the penalty for error has been reduced. If the radios prove stubbornly clear under vibration, the training syllabus may demand more radio procedure because the tool is now trustworthy enough to carry more of the burden. If the wing fold demonstrates a hinge that never ceases when grime and salt conspire, deck crews may change the choreography of parking to stack more machines in a tighter space, because confidence in motion eases fear of entrapment. None of this is instant. The most honest sentences in any of the memos generated after such an evaluation are the ones that begin with "within existing resources." That phrase is not an apology. It is an acceptance of the warrior's economy. Admire what you cannot have, adopt what you can, and most of all, imitate the conditions that made the admired thing possible. In the case at hand, that means fewer prayers to genius and more investment in process. It means making calibration a ritual and treating consistency as a weapon. The decision, in the end, was to steal not parts but attitudes. That theft is the least glamorous and most consequential kind. It changes the way a factory schedules its maintenance on tools. It changes which gauges a foreman measures with at dawn. It changes 1,000 habits that never get their photograph taken, and yet, slowly, alter the fate of fleets. The phrase that survived, "This isn't human work," was not a confession of defeat. It was an attempt, from men who knew the heft of wrenches and the bite of solvents, to name a feeling. They were confronted by a machine that behaved, in aggregate, as if disappointment had been exiled from its design. Panels came off and went on without treachery. Fasteners mated with their mates like old friends. Systems started and stopped as if nouns and verbs had been chosen carefully and would not change mid-sentence. To men who had wrestled too often with reluctant parts and unrepeatable fits, that smoothness felt eerie. How do you describe an absence of friction except by reaching for something beyond the ordinary? The honest translation is plainer. It is human work, arranged to resist human error. It is human diligence made cheap by repetition. It is human foresight captured in fixtures and gauges, so that a Tuesday afternoon does not depend on a particular craftsman having a good day. The airplane, stripped of its canvas and its myths, delivered that lesson without gloating. It asked no one to surrender pride. It asked them to adjust the axis along which pride should be measured. Less virtuosity at the bench, more virtue in the process, less worship of the one-off miracle, more respect for the quiet miracle of 1,000 parts, arriving identical enough to bolt together without a file. There is a different kind of romance in that verdict. It imagines a line of workers punching in at dawn, standing before stations where their hands do not guess, where the shop aides speak a clear language, where each man's good habits are reinforced and each bad habit has nowhere to hide. It imagines foremen who measure tools before they measure parts, planners who hide slack in schedules not to mask laziness but to guarantee that inspection can do its work, inspectors who understand that catching a defect is an act of loyalty to men who will fly. It imagines, above all, a culture that treats quality as the easiest path, not as an act of heroism. That culture had built the airplane. The visitors sensed it and, lacking a tidy term, reached for a phrase that sounded like awe. What remained, after the airplane's last panel was refitted and the last note filed, was gratitude for clarity. Magic would have been a poor teacher. Systems teach better. The lessons, once spelled out, travelled farther than any single component could have travelled if shipped home in a crate. They crossed into practices that touched everything from the way a wire is tied to the way a test hop is logged. The men who had stood around the airplane carried away a respect not only for what they had seen, but for what had made it repeatable. If there is a closing line worthy of the machine, it is this: greatness in metal is possible when patience and honesty become habits. The airplane looked superhuman only because so many humans had decided, together, to make excellence ordinary.